Reparations is the key. Reparations will set us free.
All right. So, welcome everyone to this presentation, Free to Choose, Milton Friedman on the Welfare System. This was shot in 1978, and one of the guest appearances was Thomas Sowell. So sit back and relax, and we actually might pause it to give some commentary. If you have anything you want to say in the chat, please do so. But outside of that, we will be starting this presentation shortly. And thanks for coming.
After the Second World War, New York City authorities retained rent control, supposedly to help their poorer citizens. The intentions were good. This in the Bronx was one result. By the 50s, the same authorities were taxing their citizens, including those who live in the Bronx and other devastated areas beyond the East River, to subsidize public housing. Another idea with good intentions. Yet poor people are paying for this, subsidized apartments for the well-to-do. When government at city or federal level spends our money to help us, strange things happen. The idea that government had to protect us came to be accepted during the terrible years of the Depression. Capitalism was said to have failed, and politicians were looking for a new approach. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a candidate for the presidency. He was governor of New York State. At the governor's mansion in Albany, he met repeatedly with friends and colleagues to try to find some way out of the Depression. The problems of the day were to be solved by government action and government spending. The measures that FDR and his associates discussed here derive from a long line of past experience. Some of the roots of these measures go back to Bismarck's Germany at the end of the 19th century, the first modern state to institute old age pensions and other similar measures on the part of government. In the early 20th century, Great Britain followed suit. Under Lloyd George and Churchill, it too instituted old age pensions and similar plans. These precursors of the modern welfare state had little effect on practice in the United States, but they did have a very great effect on the intellectuals on the campus, like those who gathered here with FDR. The people who met here had little personal experience of the horrors of the Depression, but they were confident that they had the solution. In their long discussions as they sat around this fireplace, trying to design programs to meet the problems raised by the worst depression in the history of the United States, they quite naturally drew upon the ideas that were prevalent at the time. The intellectual climate had become one in which it was taken for granted that government had to play a major role in solving the problems, in providing what came later to be called security from cradle to grave. Roosevelt's first priority after his election was to deal with massive unemployment. A public works program was started. The government financed projects to build highways, bridges, and dams. The National Recovery Administration was set up to revitalize industry. Roosevelt wanted to see America move into a new era. The Social Security Act was passed and other measures followed. Unemployment benefits, welfare payments, distribution of surplus food. With these measures, of course, came rules, regulations, and red tape, as familiar today as they were novel then. The government bureaucracy began to grow, and it's been growing ever since. This is just a small part of the Social Security empire today. Their headquarters in Baltimore has 16 rooms this size. All these people are dispensing our money with the best possible intentions. But at what cost? In the 50 years since the Albany meetings, we have given government more and more control over our lives and our income. In New York State alone, these government buildings house 11,000 bureaucrats, administering government programs that cost New York taxpayers $22 billion. At the federal level, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare alone has a budget larger than any government in the world, except only Russia and the United States. Yet these government measures often do not help the people they are supposed to.
All right.
Richard Brown's daughter, Halima, needs constant medical attention. She has a throat defect and has to be connected to a breathing machine so that she'll survive the nights. It's expensive treatment, and you might expect the family to qualify for a Medicaid grant.
No, I don't get it because I'm not eligible for it. I make a few dollars too much. And the salary that I make, I can't afford to really live and save anything. It's out of the question. And I mean, we live from payday to payday. I mean, literally from payday to payday.
The struggle isn't made any easier by the fact that Mr. Brown knows that if he gave up his job as an orderly at the Harlem Hospital, he would qualify for a government handout, and he'd be better off financially.
Well, Miss Davis.
Mr. Brown, do me say this thing? There's a section patient.
It's a terrible pressure on him, but he's proud of the work that he does here, and he's strong enough to resist the pressure.
Mr. Brown, and you're fully dilated, so I'm here to take you to the delivery room. Try not to push, please. You want to have a nice, sterile delivery.
Mr. Brown has found out the hard way that welfare programs destroy an individual's independence.
We have considered welfare. We went to see everybody apply for welfare, but we were told that we were only eligible for $5 a month. And to receive this $5, we would have to cash in our son's savings bonds, and that's not even worth it. But I don't believe in something for nothing anyway.
I think a lot of people are capable of working and are willing to work, but it's just the way it's set up. The mother and the children are better off if the husband isn't working or if the husband isn't there, and this breaks up so many poor families.
One of the saddest things is that many of the children whose parents are on welfare will, in their turn, end up in the welfare trap when they grow up. In this public housing project in the Bronx, New York, 3/4 of the families are now receiving welfare payments. Well, Mr. Brown wanted to keep away from this kind of thing for a very good reason. The people who get on welfare lose their human independence and feeling of dignity. They become subject to the dictates and whims of their welfare supervisor, who can tell them whether they can live here or there, whether they may put in a telephone, what they may do with their lives. They're treated like children, not like responsible adults. And they're trapped in the system. Maybe a job comes up that looks better than welfare, but they're afraid to take it, because if they lose it after a few months, it may be 6 months or 9 months before they can get back onto welfare. And as a result, this becomes a self-perpetuating cycle, rather than simply a temporary state of affairs. Things have gone even further elsewhere. This is a Hume Estate, a public housing project in Manchester, England. Well, we're 3,000 miles away from the Bronx here, but you'd never know it just by looking around. It looks as if we're at the same place. It's the same kind of flats, same kind of massive housing units, decrepit even though they were only built 7 or 8 years ago, vandalism, graffiti, the same feeling about the place of people who don't have a great deal of drive and energy because somebody else is taking care of their day-to-day needs, because the state has deprived them of an incentive to find jobs, to become responsible people, to be the real supports of themselves and their families. For the past 7 years, Maureen Ramsey has had to buy food and clothes for her family out of a government handout. For the whole of that time, her husband, Steve, hasn't had a job. Each week, he collects what's known in Britain as Social Security. The government looks after him, his wife, and their children. But accepting welfare payments means accepting the rules of those who hand them out.
My opinion, anyway, you feel as they own you. You know, there's no other way of putting it. Say I got a job tomorrow because I needed something. Well, I know that I've got to go down there and report it. Because I couldn't go into the job because you'd be looking over your shoulder thinking, well, the Social Security is coming in. I'm going to be done for it. It's just hopeless. You can't fight against it.
The jobs around now these days, you only come up with about £45 a week. Then you deduct your stamp out of that, you still finish up with about £39. So what good is it working? When you still get the same thing, you know what I mean? I can't see any sense of it.
Of course, he's quite right that it may not pay him to get a job now. That's not his fault, and I don't blame him. He's acting sensibly and intelligently for his own interest and the interest of his family. It's the fault of a system which takes away the incentive from him to get a job. But suppose you were cruel and simply took away the welfare overnight, cut it off. What would happen? He would find a job. What kind of a job? I don't know. It might not be a very nice job. It might not be a very attractive job. But at some wage, at some level of pay, there will always be a job which he could get for himself. It might be also that he would be driven to rely on some private charity. He might have to get soup kitchen help or the equivalent. Again, I'm not saying that's desirable or nice or a good thing. It isn't. But as a matter of actual fact as to what would happen, there is little doubt that he would find some way to earn a living. The American government is trying to break the welfare trap. These people were unemployed. They're now being trained at the taxpayer's expense. It may or may not lead to a real job.
Here we have a vast national welfare system, which is diametrically opposed to everything that America believes in. Because America was founded on a work ethic, has practiced the work ethic, and has said this is what we want everybody to do, the opportunity to hold a job in America.
Everyone here has to clock in and do a full day's work. It's an attempt to make it seem like a real job.
We're saying a job is a part of the American way of life, and we're going to help you find a job so that you can get a piece of the pie, you can pay taxes, you can become a part of that American dream.
But the dream isn't working. Schemes like this, run under the government's Comprehensive Education and Training Act, CETA, have a high dropout rate, and many trainees end up back where they began, on welfare. The men and women who administer CETA and similar programs, the officials of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, are dedicated people. Their motives are good. Their achievements are not. The results of these programs have been disappointing. Why? I believe that the basic reason is because it is very hard to achieve good objectives through bad means. And the means we have been using are bad in two very different respects. In the first place, all of these programs involve some people spending other people's money for objectives that are determined by still a third group of people. Nobody spends somebody else's money as carefully as he spends his own. Nobody has the same dedication to achieving somebody else's objectives that he displays when he pursues his own. Beyond this, the programs have an insidious effect on the moral fiber of both the people who administer the programs and the people who are supposedly benefiting from it. For the people who administer it, it instills in them a feeling of almost godlike power. For the people who are supposedly benefiting, it instills a feeling of childlike dependence. Their capacity for personal decision-making atrophies. The result is that the programs involve a misuse of money. They do not achieve the objectives which it was their intention to achieve. But far more important than this, they tend to rot away the very fabric that holds a decent society together.
If you think that's overstating the case, look what HEW found when it made a special investigation into the spending of the vast funds it administers.
We just got the plan from the Public Health Service on reducing the necessary beds.
In these reels of tape that record every payment made, every recipient, they found evidence that a staggering $7.5 billion had been lost by fraud, waste, and abuse in 1 year. Doctors, building contractors, hospitals, schools, welfare recipients, everyone had been fraudulently dipping into the pot, and the investigation isn't over yet. The inevitable consequence of having a huge pot of taxpayers' money is that all of us want to get our hands in it. You can be sure that we'll all be able to find very good reasons why we should be the ones to spend somebody else's money. Somebody or other put up a good case for spending taxpayers' money to subsidize rents in New York City, including the rents of these apartments. The people who occupy these apartments pay something like $200 a month less than the market rent. And that subsidy comes out of the taxes of people, most of whom are much poorer than the people who live here. It's not unusual for this sort of thing to happen when government tries to do good with our money. Look at what happened in Chicago. For most visitors, the immediate impression is of a rich, prosperous, bustling city. But like every large city in America, it has its problem areas. Overcrowded slums breeding poverty and crime. After World War II, one such area developed in Hyde Park. In the 50s, plans were drawn up to pull down large areas of slum building and to rebuild using government funds under an urban renewal program. It was to be a show project, replacing a blighted area with an integrated community. Who controlled the spending of that government money? It was, in fact, my own University of Chicago, which felt its very existence threatened by the spread of urban blight and crime. Government money was used to tear down an area that contained many small shops, as well as families of low income. Once the area was cleared, private money rebuilt it with middle-class apartments, townhouses, and shopping complexes. The blight had been cleared here, but only to be shifted elsewhere.
In many instances, when government administers large grants, a lot of those funds don't wind up directly serving the people and achieving the objectives that were the intent of the programs, because the grant has to feed that large government bureaucracy.
Joe Gardner helped to set up an organization of local black people to protect their own interests. Previously, the blacks had rioted in the streets to try to get their way. Now it was to be done peacefully using government money. When government funds became available, the Woodlawn organization got control. They used them to build the kind of houses they wanted, low-rise apartments like these. The bureaucrats, planners, and architects told them that it was uneconomical, that only high-rise blocks would work. They were wrong.
So a lot of people have this view that the disadvantaged, if you will, have no idea of what their problems are and how to resolve them, that it takes outside professionals to do that. And we say that's baloney, because the outside professional does not feel in his gut what a woman on welfare with 6 kids living off $100 a month in a deteriorated building feels. She can come up with solutions much better than a bureaucrat.
The intentions of this local community group are good. They want to rebuild the community as the community wants.
I said, are you pretty pleased with the work we're doing?
Yes, I am very pleased with it.
But government money always corrupts. Look at the number of people rebuilding this garage. It doesn't make sense, except that these are CETA workers paid for by taxpayers' money. Government funds have allowed the organization to take over a whole area of Chicago. They now have their own supermarket. They've built splendid houses for middle-class occupiers, very expensive, protected by the latest security systems, all at the taxpayer's expense.
In a sense, TWO is rapidly becoming a mini government. At this particular point, we have approximately 400 employees. We have an operating budget of in excess of $5 million a year. So we are large.
Large and expanding. Their next project is to redevelop this site. And that's only the first step in a 20-year plan that will cost $220 million, most of it coming from the taxpayers. In the South Bronx, they're very familiar with government protection, like the rent controls that made it uneconomic for landlords to maintain their buildings. They've moved out and the vandals have moved in. The South Bronx is an area where many of the people are on welfare and where the crime rate is high. But all this could change. A group of local people has begun to renovate these buildings, to build new homes. They call themselves Sweat Equity, because at first sweat and effort was all they could put into the project. Only later did they accept a small government grant. How long ago did you start working on this building?
4 months ago. On this building, right here.
And I take it what you're going to do is gut the whole thing from beginning to end.
Right, totally gutted.
And you'll have to rewire.
Wire, put new walls up, new floors, new ceilings, and everything. Worked in the winter, worked in the summer, but when I had the chance to work.
How many people have you got working here?
A good 40 people.
How do you keep them working? You know, some of them most want to get tired of it and pull off and so on. So how do you...
Try to keep them interested. We show them what could be done in the future, what will be done in the future. And they get, well, at first, it's kind of hard to prove to somebody that in the next 3-4 years, what will come out of it. They can't see it in the long range term. They only see it in the short. They need money right now, and not in 2 or 3 years.
Sure.
So we try to show them that it will happen.
It's true they now accept some government money. But so far, they've managed to retain their original philosophy that the best way to get something done well is to do it yourself.
Like what we're doing, we're bringing people out of the street, giving them something to look forward to. They have their own apartment. They'll be taking care of the area around it. They have a garden. They have something to look forward to. They can even get off welfare. We can even give them a job. They can drop the welfare and have some self-pride. That's the whole thing about it, self-pride. As long as you collect it from the government and sitting back, you have no worries. We're not sitting back. We're working. We're making that money come in. We're putting it into our building. We're building ourselves up as well as the building.
Some of these people are CETA workers, paid for by the taxpayer. But this isn't as useful as it might appear. You ask these fellows, which would they rather have, the CETA workers or the money that's being paid to the CETA workers? Which would you rather have?
The money paid to the people.
That's your answer. But that's very expensive help. In terms of what these people could use with the money, you give these people the amount of money you're paying to that CETA workers, and I'll bet they'll have twice as much, 3 times as much work out of them. Am I wrong?
You're right. You're right.
So that's a very inefficient way to use that money. The problem is you've got a bureaucracy, and the government bureaucrats, they want to decide what to do. They don't want to let you decide what exactly. Ask yourself, how did this place get built up in the first place? After all, this was a pretty respectable, solid, substantial region when it was first developed. It wasn't done through a government project. It was done by people individually, having an incentive to put up these buildings and occupy them. What these people we've been seeing here are doing is they're trying to restore that feeling and that attitude. You'll have a far healthier community here if it grows out of the self-help of people like the people we've been talking to than if it's a paternalistic venture undertaken by governmental civil servants and bureaucrats who have to plan on a large scale for other people. We must find a way to give everyone caught in the welfare trap the kind of initiative these people have. The best, or should I say the least bad solution I have ever been able to devise is something called the negative income tax. This is the idea that we should get rid of a large part of the welfare bureaucracy and of the demeaning rules. We should help people who are poor fundamentally by giving them money. With the positive income tax, you're entitled to a certain amount of personal exemptions and deductions, and above that amount you pay tax. But suppose you have no income. Under a negative income tax, a fraction of your unused exemptions would be paid to you by the government, guaranteeing at least a minimum income. If you earned something, you'd still get a fraction of your unused exemptions, and you'd end up better off. As your earnings rose, the supplement to your income would become smaller and smaller until your earnings equaled your exemptions. At that point, you'd break even, neither paying tax nor receiving a subsidy. It's not an ideal system. It's not the system we might have liked to get into, but it's a system which would have the effect of eliminating the separation of the society into those who receive and those who pay, a separation that tends to destroy the whole social fabric. It would mean that we could each of us take advantage of opportunities that opened up without fearing that if by some chance we lost our jobs, it would be a long time before we could get back on assistance. It would be a system that would give all of us an incentive gradually to improve our lives, would perhaps enable us over time to work ourselves out of the kind of mess we've gotten ourselves into. A mess we've gotten ourselves into for the very best of motives, but with the very worst of results. We have become increasingly dependent on government. We have surrendered power to government. Nobody has taken it from us. It's our doing. The results? Monumental government spending, much of it wasted, little of it going to the people whom we would like to see helped. Burdensome taxes, high inflation, a welfare system under which neither those who receive help nor those who pay for it are satisfied. Trying to do good with other people's money simply has not worked.
The discussion is already underway here at the University of Chicago, so let's join it.
As I looked at the film, I had a growing sense of anger. Anger that position failed to recognize that the system that was being attacked was necessary in our capitalistic free enterprise system that by its own failure produces poverty and therefore requires governmental intervention in the interest of those people caught in the traps of poverty. So as I sat and looked at the film and as I hear Dr. Friedman's statement, I was aroused to the point, as I said, of anger, because only half the story is told. We are really becoming again a victim, this time a system, the welfare system, for the failure of other systems to operate in the interest of people.
Let's get other reactions now to that statement. Trying to do good with other people's money simply has not worked. The welfare system is rotting away the very fabric of society. Tom Salt.
My reaction was just the opposite. My anger was at what had been created in the city where I grew up under very different conditions, during the period of capitalistic failure, during the period when there wasn't this humanitarianism, and where it was possible for people to live better and to get out of that poverty. Now, I think someone living in the very same place where I live would find it much harder to escape from that poverty because of all these things. Buildings were not abandoned like the buildings that we saw in that film when I lived in Harlem. The crime rate, all the things that are blamed upon the failures of the previous method did not exist. I slept out on the fire escapes in Harlem. I would defy anybody to do that in any part of New York City today.
Traditionally, in the United States, we have tried to avoid some of the welfare trap that was referred to by denying eligibility to people who are able-bodied and not aged and so on. And we have therefore tried to close the welfare door to a good number of categories within the poor population. The second point that was emphasized, and I think needs to be put in some perspective, is that some, but not all, of what we might call welfare programs broadly have this very strong take-back of benefits as you earn some more money. And that, I guess, is what I would like to single out as the principal problem identified in the film, but it is not common to any and all welfare programs that one might think of.
When the family fails, when the private sector fails to create jobs at a fast enough rate, you find that people are unemployed and drift into needing help in order to exist. And the welfare system was created in the 30s to do exactly that. When the private sector essentially failed, we have the development of a welfare system. It is not corrupting society. It is taking what society institutions have left behind. The family breaking up, the economy not expanding fast enough, the health system failing, the educational system not doing its job. We have untrained, unskilled people looking for jobs in a highly technical society, or jobs that pay so low that people cannot, in fact, live in a decent level of humanity. I see the welfare system not corrupting, but in fact taking the remains and attempting to help people live in dignity.
So rotting away the fabric of society is not supported, except perhaps by you. Would you back that phrase?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You're talking about the failures of the other parts of society. What the welfare system and other kinds of governmental programs are doing is paying people to fail. Insofar as they fail, they receive the money. Insofar as they succeed, even to a moderate extent, the money is taken away. This is even extended into the school systems, where they will give money to schools with low scores. Insofar as the school improves its education, the money is taken away, so that you are subsidizing people to fail in their own private lives and become more dependent upon the handouts.
We have expectations built in today about the quality of life, the quality of job, the level of income for which one expects in return. Why? Because we look at the level around us that it takes us to have
No,
a
that's not
fairly
why.
decent level.
No, that's not why. I may have all sorts of expectations. The question is, what can I do? If someone else is subsidizing my expectations will be far higher. Insofar as the Center for Advanced Study was subsidizing my expectations a few years ago, I refused to work at UCLA for the normal full professor's salary. Why should I, when I can get the same money for being at the Center for Advanced Study with no hours, no duties, and no classes?
Let's look at another proposition in Milton's case, the insidious effect on those who receive welfare. They lose their human independence and dignity, are treated like children, and so on. Now, Dr. Dumpson, as a former administrator of a major program, is that a great hazard?
That is not a great hazard. As a matter of fact, that presumes that people get on welfare, stay on welfare, and therefore have the result that Dr. Friedman's statement issues. The fact of the matter is that in our AFDC programs throughout the country, in particular, it was true in New York, there is a gradual turnover of the welfare AFDC roles. About a third of them go off each year. Now, if these people were so destroyed by the system, when they go off, they wouldn't go into employment, they wouldn't hold employment, they wouldn't stay off the rolls for 6 months, 18 months, 24 months, as long as they are able to stay off. So there's something wrong with that argument when one looks at people and what they do. People, who are poor are no different from those of us who are not poor. and their motivation for self-dependency, self-support, and mobility in the economic scale is no different than than the motives we have, so that they will not let the system. You remember, Dr. Friedman, the welfare rights organizations who refused to let the system squelch them down as it was attempting to do. And we turned the policies around.
You and I agree completely that the people who are poor and are on welfare rolls are no different from the rest of us. Of course not. They are human beings, and they deserve every sympathy and every possibility of making their own way. But the welfare system makes them different.
But you give them
it makes it in their interest to be
How
different.
do you account for them going off the rolls?
But figures are figures, and you've got to be careful with figures. The fact that a third, there's a turnover of a third, does not mean that there aren't half who are on all the time. People come on, go off, come on, go off. We've got to have the other figure.
The latest statistic, Dr. Friedman, is that 34% of the people on AFDC are on for 5 years or longer. And when one thinks of the purpose of the AFDC program, which was the rearing and support of children, dependent children, minor children, I would submit to you that 5 years is not a terribly long time for a mother and children to have to be dependent if there's no other source of income.
I think the other data, we have a program in Pennsylvania for essentially all of those who are not taken care of by the AFDC program. It's called a General Assistance Program, and there, less than 15% are on more than 18 months. So we have a great turnover. We have essentially young males moving into the welfare system after unemployment compensation and then moving out when a job opportunity comes along. This, I think the notion of generations of people on welfare is a very small minority in the whole system. That doesn't mean that the system as presently defined and as the set of programs that we have put together don't often contradict each other. And I'm the first to agree with Dr. Friedman that some of the programs are conflicting. However, I think it is overly broad to say that we turn people into helpless children.
I don't remember talking to anyone who's ever been on welfare who didn't think they were being treated like children while they were on it.
Of course, one must make a difference, a distinction between the system that was set up to help people and the people who are employed in that system. Look at any public welfare system around the country, and we have practically few trained people to work with people. We employ the ill-trained, people who are not equipped to be helping people. We say they're social workers. They're not social workers. They have neither the skills, the attitudes, and some of them not even the concern. So I think one has to separate out a conceptual framework of a system designed to help people and what the country and community puts into that system to implement those programs.
You mean separate the hopes from the reality?
I separate the skills that are available in order to implement what the objectives of the program are. And I think we have to separate whether we're talking about program objectives or we're talking about how it operates. I would be the first to say that the system that I administered had ill-prepared people to do the job that we were set up to do. But I would not say that the system that we set up.
I talked to some social welfare people who think that, in fact, they were so hamstrung by the system that there was very little they could do to help people to get off welfare. That is, to build up skills, get jobs, do whatever was necessary to get off welfare. They felt it was the system.
Bob Lappin,
the system that we're stereotyping is one of a great deal of paternalistic interference in individual families' lives. And in fact, isn't this true, Mr. Dumpson? The caseload is so high for an individual welfare worker that they can't do a lot of interfering in individual family lives. Moreover, in the last decade, there's been a real attempt to ease this welfare trap in AFDC by changing the take-back rate and by administering work expenses and child care expenses in such a way as to facilitate work by those who may want to do it. So it's not quite as harsh a picture as we sometimes get, that there is this omniscient welfare worker who's right there in the living room with the family and making all their decisions for them.
I've never heard of a government program which was defective, in which the people who ran it didn't say, if only we had more money to spend on what we're not being able to accomplish with the amount we're spending now.
Milton, I'm going to move on now to some of your prescriptions in that film, because I think it's a good ground for discussion. The most drastic one was when you said, speaking of an unemployed man, Supposing you were cruel and took away welfare from this man, he would find a job at some wage. There would always be a job he could get. He might need some charity en route, private charity, but he would get a job. Now, I want you to react, those of you, before we come back to Milton on that. Is that a picture that seems plausible to you?
He may get a job, but he may get a job in what we refer to as the underground economy. And that's where a number of our youth are now going to get their jobs. Those activities that are illegal, and the only opportunity they have for earning part of a livelihood.
I think the other issue is that you have a whole group of people who are the single female head of a household. And yes, cut off welfare tomorrow. What will they do? What will be their immediate response? At what price to their small children and to their middle-aged children? Yes, they'll get a job. In fact, the statistics show that women, in fact, are the most successful through the employment program. But what has to supplement that typically is the provision of some kind of daycare arrangement. Either the individual woman has to earn enough money to be able to pay privately for her daycare, or in fact, she is, quote, subsidized through this insidious corrupting set of programs run by the federal government, which in fact makes her employable and a taxpayer. It's an interesting notion of trying to get people in a productive mode.
Tom Sowell.
It's incredible the way you start the story in the middle, as if there's a predestined amount of poverty, a predestined amount of unemployment, and that the welfare system is not itself in any way responsible for that.
There is a predestined 20% of the bottom half of the population.
I have never, that's always been true.
There's going to be 20% at the bottom.
It's also true that 20% of the bottom population doesn't have to be living on the government and ruled by the government. You mentioned, for example, the female-headed household. Many of those, in addition to the grown woman who has all the kids, are teenage pregnancies. There's not a predestined amount of teenage pregnancy. I grew up in an era when people, and particularly blacks, were a lot poorer than today, faced a lot more discrimination than today, and in which the teenage pregnancy rate was a lot lower than today. I don't believe there is a predestined amount of teenage pregnancy, a predestined amount of husband desertion. Gutman has done a study of the black family, showing that this whole notion that the black family has always been disintegrating, that is nonsense. That his studies go up to 1925. The great bulk of black families were intact, two-parent families up through 1925, and going all the way back through the era of slavery. So it is now only within our own time that we suddenly see this inevitable tragedy, which the welfare system says it's going to rush in to solve, but which it is itself a part.
We're talking about a very small group. We're talking about 12% of the families are not intact. Are not two-parent families at any one period of time.
I mean, among welfare recipients?
No, among the public at large. We're talking about 12% of the families. 12%.
That's right.
That's a small number. But
none of those on welfare.
We're still talking about a significant component of the bottom 20% that are the bottom 20%. Whether they are above the poverty line or below the poverty line, they are still the bottom 20%. And the issue is, what is the responsibility of the other 80%, if any?
Does your program plan to eliminate there being a bottom 20%?
No, but it intends to raise the bottom 20%.
You're raising them by having more illegitimacy, more unemployment.
I'm not making them have illegitimate children. I hope that's clear.
Oh, I think you don't have to do that. You simply subsidize it.
We as human beings don't have a responsibility, but I hope we have a compassion and an interest in the bottom 20%. And I only want to say to you that the capitalist system, the private enterprise system in the 19th century did a far better job of expressing that sense of compassion than the governmental welfare programs are today. The 19th century, the period which people denigrate as a high tide of capitalism, was a period of the greatest outpouring of eleemosynary and charitable activity that the world has ever known. And one of the things I hold against the welfare system most seriously is that it has destroyed private charitable arrangements which are far more effective, far more compassionate, far more person-to-person in helping people who are really, for no fault of their own, in disadvantaged situations.
I have to disagree with you, though, because I think that the whole notion of private property was excluded. Whole segments of society were excluded from the notion of private property in the 19th century, namely women, idiots, and imbeciles. And so I don't go back to the 19th century and hold that up as any paragon that we would want to replicate today.
Anyway, I want Milton now to come to your major prescription, which I know you don't say is on the agenda for tomorrow, but it lies ahead. That is the negative income tax. And I'm not sure people fully understand how it would work. We can't, I think, go to the details of it, but I'd like to get a reaction around the panel, first of all. Is this a viable approach to the enduring problems of poverty? Negative income tax.
I think it's a viable approach to some part of the problems of poverty. It involves, first of all, cash payments rather than in-kind payments, as I understand it. It involves payments on a non-categorical basis.
What do you mean non-categorical?
That is to say, it doesn't matter whether you're a female-headed family or a male-headed family, or whether you're young or old, whether you're sick or well.
If your income falls below a certain level,
you pay some guaranteed income level for people based on family size, and then it has a take-back rate, which is modest, I suppose, by definition. Now, the question is how many things you want to use that program to replace. How many things you want to replace with such a negative income tax program.
Would you replace everything with, just to clear that point up, would you virtually wipe out the remaining forms of welfare if you got this program going?
Yes, I would not. I think its purpose is precisely to provide a transition between where we are now and where we would like to go. Because because I agree with you that given that we've corrupted the people on welfare and gotten them on there, we do have an obligation not to throw them out in the street and put them in the difficult adjustment you've made. We've got to ease it off.
Sure.
And so, but I would want to replace all present welfare programs.
Now let's get reactions to this. We'll come back to you.
Well, I saw some figures recently which said that if you took all the money spent on poverty in the United States and divided it by all the poverty family, you come up with a figure of $32,000 per family. Now, the average poverty family apparently is not getting the $32,000. And so clearly someone in between the Treasury and those families is getting an awful lot of that money. And I think that if you simply eliminated the middleman, as they say in the commercials, that there'd be an awful lot of benefit both to the poor and to the taxpayers.
I'm supportive of the negative income tax concept and the objective of it. I'd like to point out, however, that administratively, we have another bureaucracy set up. Somebody has to take into account earnings. Someone has to decide when to pay back that which they're entitled to. There's a time lag between the paying back, the earning and the paying back. There are a variety of problems in there that I will be prepared to accept, but I want you to know that government intervention is not going to be eliminated.
The issue that I have is, where do children come in? What are their rights under a negative income tax? And are we, by building in a negative income tax, in fact, subsidizing
All right, family, we're going to stop it there. So for those who are watching, and we appreciate it, we're just going to give our notes here real quick, and within the next 10 minutes, I believe looks like the video has about 10 or 15 more minutes left. So I'm going to go ahead and put in the chat. Let's see here. Let me see if I can go get the link. And I'm going to put the chat if you guys want to, guys and gals, if you want to look at the rest of the video from the YouTube page called Real Black. You can go there, watch the debate back in 1978. It's in the chat, and you can watch the rest of it. So we're just going to give our notes here and then wish everyone a wonderful evening. And so thank you for your time. So
yeah, happy Friday, happy weekend, and shout out to Real Black. You'll want to swing by that to watch the end of this show, but also their catalog that they've amassed on their channel. Black content is amazing.
Yeah, definitely go support the page Real Black. I think Real Black actually has a website too as well. I believe I don't know the brother's name off the top of my head, but I believe he's a filmmaker as well, but just decided to do this to put stuff up to YouTube. I mean, he has a whole bunch of stuff up there regarding the Black community.
And actually I like it because like I said, it's like cataloging the history. As you know, our history is kind of all over the place. Just seeing a lot of stuff about this now, but the way that it's aggregated in one place is just really, really cool.
Yeah. So before we go into our notes, I want to actually share my screen here. So I'm going to see if I can pull this article up. Here, let me see if I can pull this up. And all right. And okay, so here is the article by Business Insider. Let's see, can the family see that? Yep, y'all can see that. Let me go back to the article. It says how decades of U.S. welfare policies lifted up the white middle class and largely excluded Black Americans. So let's go to the article here, and I'll just read a couple of paragraphs. When President Donald Trump met with the Congressional Black Caucus in 2018, the topic of welfare reform came up. One member of the caucus told Trump that enforcing stricter rules would be detrimental to her constituents, not all of whom are Black, according to NBC News. The president is said to have replied, "Really? Then what are they?" Apparently assuming that a welfare recipient couldn't be white. In fact, far more white people have benefited from U.S. welfare programs over the years, reflecting their greater share of the population, while Black people and other people of color have been denied them in various ways, multiple historians and researchers tell Business Insider. The coronavirus pandemic has exposed the underbelly of American inequality in many ways, with people of color disproportionately likely to be laid off, to be on the financial brink, and to die from the virus. That has helped prompt a growing chorus of financiers, business leaders, and regular folks to call for a re-imaging of American capitalism and for moves to end racial inequality. Some top economists are calling for a, quote, new deal, specifically targeting inequality, a platform to which Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden seems open. If the country is to move forward in trying to lift Americans out of unemployment and poverty, policymakers might consider who has benefited most from past welfare policies and how much policies have helped produce today's world. Business Insider talked to 4 economic researchers and historians and analyzed the past 90 years of welfare policy, then considering the question of who the status quo actually benefits. Sanford Scram, a political science professor at CUNY Hunter who wrote Disciplining the Poor and Hard White, puts it bluntly. I do think the federal government has been complicit in the perpetration of race-based discrimination that has led to African Americans lagging behind whites. No question about it. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and so we could start getting more into the commentary. So let's put up the cover image here. So what do you, first of all, what do you think came of what we saw? You want to give your commentary a little bit, and then I'll give mine.
Well, the first thing I have written down, or actually towards the end, is corrupted people on welfare. I'm sorry, I don't know all the speakers' names in that, but the white guy at the end was like, "We've corrupted people on welfare, and we have to make right on that." So I kind of took that as a note and a talking point, just to show that this was intentional. They knew that they were corrupting a community. They did it anyways. And welfare was obviously, per what we just saw, intended to keep the 20% down. The 20%, was that Black people? I mean, in the comments to you in the private chat, I was like, were we 20% at one time? And then now we're 13%. Maybe that's due to mass incarceration and everything else that's going on. But when they were talking about the 20%, they were saying the 20% was meant to be down to lift the 80%. And we know that most Black people were on the welfare rolls at that time, was my takeaway from it.
Okay, so let's just kind of go over some of these points. In the video, it said they recorded some reels of tape, and it lost, or the welfare system said it lost about 7.5 billion lost in fraud, waste, and abuse in 1 year of taxpayers' money. And some of those culprits were doctors, building contractors, and the like. So when we look at this and we see this obvious waste of money that's probably been wasted since the concept of the United States of America. But in this particular case in 1978, when they actually went back and saw this fraud stuff happening, 7.5 billion. I'm not an economist, so I'm not even going to try to do the interest on what that looks like today. But that's a lot of money being wasted. And also what was mentioned in there was that if the money could just go straight to the people, because for some reason it was going to all these other individuals and not going to straight to the people. So what do you have to say about that?
I say that, it's drawing parallels to what we're seeing today with the COVID funding, the federal COVID funding. I've spoken with you. I've said it on the show about the rental assistance that has been provided by the federal government, and it's more than the 7.5 billion that you were talking about back in the day. So if you're talking about interest numbers, I don't even know how many billions it is, as a matter of fact, but it's a lot. And these like you said, these programs that are administering the funds, they're doing an ineffective job, just like they were doing back in the day. And there's still lots of waste and fraud, and they still haven't figured it out.
It also mentioned in the video where some residents in a high rise, and it looked like a pretty well-to-do community in that high rise. I don't know if for those who want to actually go back and look at the video, please take a look at the video. But there was a clip in there where they went to a high rise and they showed these apartments that looked pretty well off, well to do. And supposedly those people were getting subsidized, as well as the individuals who were in the lower income bracket. And so the question is, like, why were they getting subsidized, especially in New York? I mean, the cost of living in New York is atrocious. I could be wrong, but I think New York has to be either the most expensive or one of the most expensive places behind or in front of San Francisco and Los Angeles and maybe Seattle. But New York is a very expensive place to live. So that's something that I wanted to let the audience and anybody listening to take note of. And also, let's briefly talk about the Woodlawn organization, who actually built their community quite well from government funded or government funding. So what do you have to say about that one?
Well, Woodhill, I'm wondering where they're at in today's conversation, if they still exist. And earlier when we were talking about it, you said that community is still primarily Black. I'm just wondering where they are in this narrative. Maybe they could be good testimony, especially with all this reparations activity. We have the reparations task force out here in California, to even give testimony and say, hey, here's what we did. We're still here. But then again, I asked you, well, what's going on with the rest of Chicago? That seems to be like a, high crime area. But Woodlawn, with their government assistance, seems to be still thriving.
Yeah, and if people watch in the video, they will see individuals working. They will see them actually gentrifying their neighborhoods. They will see individuals actually working, creating jobs. And when they were given the money, if people can go back and look at the video, supposedly there were some construction people who were like, look, why don't you make high rise apartment complexes, quote unquote projects. And the people in the community was like, no, we don't want that. We actually want low rise because this is what we want. This is how we see it. And so that's how those buildings were built. And that's how they were made. And so this is a great example of how reparations can actually be implemented to Black people. And I know, Kim, you said in the private chat, are there Black communities? Do Black communities still exist? Well, yes. I mean, in some parts, obviously with integration, not as much than it was, pre, the civil rights era and et cetera. But yeah, I mean, once again, you have a place like Woodlawn, which in Chicago, which is predominantly, I think the last statistic I read was like 80% African American. Now, I think, the income levels could be, I think the median or mean or something like was around $26,000, which obviously that could go up. But for the most part, it seems like their area pretty much was stabilized since this documentary was made.
I would say you spoke on New York and the subsidized high-rise apartments. And again, when we were going over the material earlier, I'm like, is that Section 8? And you're like, oh, that don't look like Section 8 to me. But I do know that New York had, rent controls. They were known for their strong rent controls. I think even San Francisco did surpass them in, rent when the tech industry came in. So that might have been something that the government was paying through rent controls. I'm not sure, but that's something that we definitely need out here in California.
Yeah, so I guess the question out of all
And what you
this
said
is,
about people working and building back the community, I was going to
Mhm.
say that there's a real life example of that going out here in Sacramento, California, with the Aggie Square in Oak Park. There's going to be tons of construction jobs available to build that, new facility, state of the art facility in Oak Park, which we know people in Sacramento at least know is being gentrified. But how many Black people are going to get those jobs? Everything is so, controlled now. I and they mentioned time and time again through the presentation that the funds just are not trickling down to those people that they're intended for. And like I say, I see parallels to what we're dealing with today.
right. Yeah, I mean that's a great point. I mean, we talk about something like Aggie Square. I mean, there's a great possibility that the majority of people who are going to be able to take advantage of either distributing jobs or actually getting the jobs probably most likely won't be Black or African American. That's just historically speaking. That's just how it's been. So in the video, it specifically went to this community that they knew that they were going to be affected by this money that was allocated strictly to them. And I think people who are advocates for reparations, this is something that we're talking about. I mean, this is a great example about how African Americans can be, and in most cases, are accountable. I mean, throughout history, I mean, from fighting in wars for the United States, from, participating in corporate America, to every part of the American system, Black people have participated in and been held accountable. So,
I mean,
go
starting
ahead.
with building it, we got to start there.
Right. Great point. So, first of all, yeah, I mean, yeah, we
And since
definitely
we're
built it in
speaking of
America.
Aggie Square and our reparations work out here in Sacramento, since we still have this clip handy, I'll just play what Mayor Darrell Steinberg, our mayor out here in Sacramento, had to say about reparation, the city's reparation efforts.
Well, First thing, I'm not going to make the decisions unilaterally in any way as the mayor of the city. That wouldn't be right. First thing I'm going to do, I'm wary of study commissions, and that's not what I'm intending. But I am intending to put together a diverse cross-section of leadership in our community, in the African American community, to engage in some public process, to advise me and the city council on what a commitment to reparations should look like.
So what should a commitment to reparations look like?
That's a good question. I mean, that's why we're having, the CA
This
reparations
discussion,
task
and
force. Well, also the
how
task
do you
force.
how do you feel about reparations, versus welfare? That's a big part of the argument and pushback that we hear in our reparations discussion is that, you've been paid through welfare. And as we just saw from welfare, that was actually a system intended to keep us down.
Yeah, well, not only did it intended to keep us down, but it did. you know, I mean,
It worked like a charm.
Hey, so, but in terms of, your question, that's why they're having the task force, right? To decide, okay, this is what it looks like. So obviously the welfare system is atrocious. It doesn't work. And it's never worked. And obviously, there's a group of people who've benefited from it more than others. So that's why we keep saying only thing that will repair Black Americans, people who descend from U.S. chattel slavery, is reparations. And I'm so proud of California in leading the way to study this and eventually make proposals to the government. And, shout out to Gavin Newsom for signing AB 3121 into its current state. Yep. And he's actually going to, the Californians are looking, hopefully not to recall him, but, he's in the recall situation right now. So we will know on September 14th. And if you're in California, put in your ballot. I think
just vote no.
Yep. Just vote no. So
that's our task force there. And thank you for joining us tonight. I think we'll let everybody get on to, following up on the information that we provided tonight, watching the video in full, and just really dissecting the diabolical system that welfare really was, and to not, let anybody convince you that reparations is welfare, because reparations is a debt that's owed, and that's why we, fight for it. Any last words?
Nope. See you next time.
See you next time.